We're on.
I'm Louisa Scioscia Stephens. I'm 56 years old, and we're in Grand Central Station on March the 9th, 2004, and I'm interviewing my son.
And I am Gregory Stephens, 38 years old, same location and time, being interviewed by my fabulous mom.
So, Greg, let's get right down to business. Now, what was that you were saying about sneaking up into the catwalk of Grand Central Station and walking between those windows?
What I said was, when I was a kid, these are the fun things that one did, especially if your parents let you take the train into the city after school. And that particular adventure was finding a way to get up into the glass floors that are between the two windows. And at that time, the windows were still blacked out, left over from war safety many years ago. And so I got to see it both before and after the big re-cleaning of Grand Central Station.
So you mean the windows that looked out, those are blacked out? You couldn't.
Grand Central Station, like many of the older buildings, used to have the equivalent of blackout curtains. The windows were spray painted black, and the ceiling had gotten dusty and dark, and so there was a fabulous change when they cleaned the windows and let the light stream in.
So you went up when it was dark, or you went up when it was light?
I think that I went up when it was dark, and then again with a girlfriend many years later.
Oh, man. So that's quite an adventure. Any other bad things you did like that?
Many.
Oh. How about one? Just one.
One other bad thing to tell one's mom in a booth in Grand Central Station. I should go to I guess to my youth. We've actually talked about it before, and sneaking off to Lake Placid is a great story.
That is a great story. That's a great story from both our points of view.
Because I had the opportunity to stay for a week with my best friend in the whole wide world, David Cooper, whose parents had a beach house cabin in Lake Placid. And my parents, you chief among them, along with Dad, had pretty strict rules about who managed what time. But I secured permission to visit David, and it was great permission because I could take the bus up by myself and stay with him and his parents for a week. Unfortunately, not all of the aspects of the story were true. And
the permission granted was not for what you in fact did?
Right. That's the best of all stories have some little element like that. But the thing that was hardest, or the thing that I'm proud of, although I suffered for it later, is we got to the bus depot quite late. And you remember dropping me off, unfortunately, after the bus left.
So sorry, Gregory.
It's all right, because I found another bus that went to almost the same place. and that unfortunately was the unraveling of the plan, because that bus stopped many, many times along the way. And by the time I got to Lake Placid, my poor friend David had already called you to find out if I was coming, and it inadvertently revealed that actually there'd be no parents there.
I do remember that.
Right.
Right.
The best part for me is that I was prepared to simply take it. I arrived in a town close to Lake Placid, about 20 miles away, and in pitch dark, and there were no friends there to pick me up.
And how old were you? About 15 or 16?
Something like that. Yeah, and I was actually resting against a telephone pole in the parking lot when a police car drove up. And the policeman leaned out, and I was sure I was going to be busted for vagrancy or something. I didn't have enough money. Your father tells stories of what happens if they stop you. You don't have any dollars in your pocket. And instead, he leaned out and he asked if I was Greg Stephens. And I was taken aback. I was all ready to put my hands out and pop into the back of the car. But I said I was. And he said, your mom's really worried about you. You should call your mom. And that's it. And he drove off. And so I called you from a payphone and told you not to worry. I had plenty of money, and yes, I had been bad, but everything was going to get taken care of now. We were good to go. Things were good.
So just one more lie.
Why? Lie's so harsh. One more adaptation, one more of me being the diplomat to help protect self
right,
and
to
keep you from worrying.
Yeah,
right. Because worry, it really strains you.
No, the truth of the matter is you were always a perfect kid.
Right. So I went into that bar and asked if there was any chance I could sleep there. And they said, no way. None at all. And I actually slept in a trailer home with what seems like 40 dogs, but probably was only 2 or 3. I slept on a sofa. and with all the dogs
And
crawling
how did
around.
that happen exactly?
When I left, I said thanks. When I left, one of the women came out and asked out of the bar and asked if it was really true that I didn't have a place to stay. And I told her half the story, and so they let me sleep there, and I hitched a ride to Lake Placid that next morning. And the second part of the story, not mine, is that David, on his way over to meet me at the bus station that I didn't actually arrive at, had to take a boat, and he also was operating a little bit beyond his parents' permission, and his boat broke down. So he was drifting along Lake Placid with this one paddle, trying to get to shore, hoping that he could get there in time to pick me up, and he ended up sleeping in someone else's house about halfway around the lake, and so and that's why he called to find out what actually had happened to me. So do you remember my punishment for this terrible misdeed?
No, I don't think we ever punished you, honey.
I was given the choice between being grounded forever and washing all the windows in the first floor.
Oh, that's
right. I opted for the window washing.
Oh, because otherwise you'd still be grounded.
Otherwise I'd still be grounded.
Right.
We wouldn't be here today. Right? It'd be
right.
over.
That's right.
Forget marriage and kids.
Gee, I wish somebody would do something like that again, because those windows need another little wash.
You have to work on your last kid.
Right, my last kid, right. Yeah, well, that was a good story now, all these years later. I guess it's like almost 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And did you have a nice time that week?
I did.
Oh, good.
I had a great time.
That's good. So let's talk about bicycle riding. How about?
Sure.
Now, bicycle riding, the first major trip I remember of yours was, I think it was some kind of planned trip, and you bicycled to some islands or something like that?
The first bicycling trip, I mean, when I was in high school, we'd just come out of New York City I actually spent 5th grade in Hastings, and it was an astonishing change because there was
Going from New York City to...
space everywhere. There was grass everywhere, squirrels and raccoons, wandered wild. And as growing up in Hastings, the parts that I wanted out of is, to be 16 or 17 or 18, the town was slow. And so I had a fine time with my friends playing stickball, but I also wanted to see more of everything. And so I would save up money, and my actual first trip was a bicycling trip, an organized bicycling trip, like you say, and I think it was 11 days, and we ended up in Block Island, and I'd convinced you also to sign off on letting me have a side trip of my own for 2 days, and so for one night, and so I spent 2 days on my own on Block Island, and slept on the beach, and being alone on an adventure is half great and half being totally alone and not really knowing anybody. Yeah. I got better at that as I got older. But the next trip I took was a long canoe trip, and that's the one where I starved. I tell everybody about that trip. There's no 16-year-old can live on rice and beans. We spent a few days practicing with canoes, and then a whole bunch of us just canoed out from a spot in Maine, and we brought all the food we had with us, and so for days on end we paddled, and I got thinner and hungrier. I was there with another guy who was also about 16. It was just, you think of, for me, most of my adolescent memories are all hormonal and school related, except for this one set of 3 weeks when this guy and I were hungry all the time. We would eat anything. We would eat other people's leftover food. We once caught a fish, and we were ready to eat the fish, but the fish got away. The other fellow had actually caught it when we'd patiently waited while other people rowed and snatched the fish
out of the water with
with bare hands. But then we lost it again. We had it for a while. We had dinner for a while, then it got away.
What would you have done? How would you have eaten? Just raw?
We would have burned it. We would have made a fire. We would have cooked it. We were already making fires because we were preparing things like the pasta or the beans or the rice.
Oh, I see.
all these
fire going.
Right. So this would have been fish. This would have halted the...
Wasn't there a story of some kid there who knew the score and who had some secret candy bars or something like that?
There were people... Well, they didn't. It's not that they brought candy bars; it's that they just didn't need as much food. we needed food all the time. We couldn't. There was no. You couldn't save anything. We were licking the edges of the trays, trying to get the last little bit. We would eat dandelion leaf. Anything that we could find, we would eat. We're just so hungry.
Gregory, did you eat dandelion leaves?
Yeah, I would still eat dandelion leaves. You have them in salads, but now it's very shishi. At the time, it was desperation. But yeah, that was a great adventure because we thought of cool things to do. We lashed the canoes together, and on a windy day, spread all our jackets with the arms tied. And actually, we went several miles just with the wind pushing us along.
You lashed them together with what?
Rope.
With rope, and then the jackets were a sail.
Yes.
Oh man, that is
so
great.
It was great
that
fun.
Is great. Yeah.
And so this was all training for a life of travels and adventures.
Right, and you certainly have had some.
Yes.
So, is the most recent travel your bicycle trip from California?
It is.
So how about that? Let's hear a little bit about that.
Sure. By then I've changed. I'm married. I have 2 kids. Teaching for years, and I told my wife that the one thing that I missed was going off on a trip where you had to deal with being alone. So different from having your house filled with kids and friends and chaos, it was just really how I like it.
Which one? You like the house filled with kids and friends and chaos?
I do.
Yeah, me too. But you just occasionally want to have a little
right
solitude and grappling.
That's right. So it had been right, and she's an angel.
Yeah, I know.
And she said, if you need to take a trip, do it. It's that's how I met her. So that's certainly a story to work in. But she remembered that and said, take it.
Okay, so take it. So let's work in the story of meeting her, and then let's come back to this. So we're sort of whipping back and forth in time.
Right.
So meeting
in the traditional mom-son relationship,
exactly.
You actually are the boss.
I know, so. I love it. I just love
it. Till we open that door again.
Right, that's right.
I go on my own independent adventure. I met my wife in the middle of a long personal journey. And when I got out of college, I worked for a year and a half in a suit here in New York, in Midtown, for Harper & Row, in a little cubby with a bunch of little cubbies around, and I just couldn't take it at all. And even though I still feel badly that so many people worked so hard to put me in that spot, there was no way I was going to make it. And so I left that job and offered myself to anyone who needed me. And my friend David's father said that he could really use some help working on his house there in Lake Placid. The first thing I did, though, is I worked at Eastern Mountain Sports for a while. And then I took all my savings and I got rid of my apartment. And I went off.
Where was that apartment?
It was right near where Dad's store is now, Washington Avenue.
You lived down there? You live on Washington Avenue?
Yes, with a girl.
I don't recall any of this.
Yeah, well.
Did I know?
You did. You did. 40 minutes isn't going to be enough. Some of this, you're going to have to write some of this stuff down and say, I got to get you back in here.
Okay, so back in there.
So I traveled to Amsterdam to visit a friend and bicycled south and alone, and that was a fabulous trip. Amsterdam was flat and full of canals and easy places to ride, and I loved it. And I worked my way into the mountains, and it was freezing cold at times, and tranquil in a way because I was on my own and on a bike and traveling.
But where did you sleep? How did you
I slept where I could find spots. Yep, I brought a tent. Slept where I could find spots. I remember once missing a hostel. Our hostel was closed, and so I just pushed on, and actually I saw a bunch of other people in tents, and so I joined them, just slept, and then in the morning left again. Another funny thing that happened to me, my only, the only experience where you can sort of feel the world shifting around you, I pushed into some bramble and set up my tent, and it began to snow, and I didn't have enough clothes, and I slept, and I fell asleep, and that was fine. But when I woke up, and I'm getting out, and I'm stretching, I realized that in the dark, I had pitched my tent on the very last section of land before it fell down into the So I'm just standing there thinking, You're there stretching and innocent. You look down and I realize that, in any misadventure in the night, getting out to go to the bathroom, I could have just stepped off the edge and all that would be left would be my bike on one side. So that was strange.
Oh, this is very scary.
Right? They're done now.
Right.
And I remember another bizarre thing that happened to me there is wondering where I was and seeing a field and crawling up through, leaving my tent and my bike behind, and crawling up on this field and thinking, oh, how pastoral. There were cows. There was a barn. Saying, great, I'm ready to rejoin civilization. And at that moment, I lost all my senses and I was flung forward and I just fell into the pasture. And as I was there, sort of shaking my head, thinking, what could possibly have happened? I realized I had crawled under and just stopped past the electrified fence without realizing it.
Oh.
And so when I stood up, the back of my calves hit the wire, and I was just shocked forward. Cows have got to be tougher than I was.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah. And
in this story, are you finished college? So you're like 23 or something like that?
I am. Yeah, the one caveat here is I have no idea what dates any of these things, how we could figure them all out. But on that trip, I had actually purchased 2 round-trip tickets. So after 3 weeks, I flew home from Nice, fixed everything on my bike, washed everything, and then a few days later, flew to Rome and intended to bicycle back up to Paris. But I got stuck in Nice again and just stayed there for most of it. And the way this all relates eventually back to meeting my wife is that I met a different girl there. And when I got back to the United States, my intention was just visit various people that I'd met. And this girl lived in Canada, so I took the train up again with my bike and bicycled out to meet her, and she was just horrified. Since for me, most of it was the bicycling. I didn't call or send notes or anything. It just didn't strike me as that big a deal. But apparently she had her own life and boyfriend, and there was so I represented a real intrusion of
a vacation into reality.
Of endless summer into your quotidian days. And so she actually met me in a diner just outside of her town.
You say, Greg?
Yeah. Not one step further, right? And I said, fine. And she said, well, what did you think that we would have a whole future? And I said, no. What I thought is that I traveled through Europe. I traveled here. I don't even know where to be. She was fun, and but we laughed about it, had breakfast, and I went back. And
went back where?
Back to Montreal,
mm-hmm.
where I was going to take the train south. And the hostels were full. Actually, the hostels had been full on my way out, too. And I slept in the back of a truck. The truck didn't have a cab, so I thought I was sure that I would wake up if someone actually attached a cab to it. But on the way back, I really was worried about missing the train, so I rented a room from the university there. McGill University. And it was almost deserted because it was summer. And in the university, they're set up with like a boys' side and a women's side, and in the middle, you can just hang out, read. And I was calling someone. I was calling someone I knew in New York, and the only other person in McGill University in that lobby area was a young woman. And when we sat down to read, she said hi, and I said hi, and we actually got to talking. I'm sure half because we were the only people there. And she was from Spain, and she thought possibly I was either from France or from Canada because she'd heard me speaking in French. But that was our first icebreaker because I wasn't. I said, no, I was born and raised in the United States. And before we knew it, we'd gone out for a fabulous pasta dinner, and we'd chatted away half the night. And then we had to go back to our separate, to the girls' side and then the boys' side. And I told her that I was so worried about missing the train in the morning that she loaned me her alarm clock.
Oh, that's very nice.
It was very sweet.
So typical, right?
Right, that's right. And so in the morning, I snuck into the girls' side and knocked on her door so I could give her back the alarm clock. And bleary-eyed, she took the alarm clock back and wrote down her address, the address where we'd all been staying. But she, of course, was going to school in McGill, And I had no idea what the address, anything, so that I could write her a card. And that great dinner and the great conversation, and really the more seriousness of it than with what I'd been doing for the last few months really struck me.
What do you mean, the seriousness of what you're talking about, or that you're both reading, or something different?
That I had worked a job for a while and then left it. That I'd worked in a retail outdoor clothing store for a while and then left that and traveled around on a bike, all of which I loved. And I really had a great time, and it was my own money that I'd earned, and in a way I felt very independent because I was riding on a bicycle instead of taking a car or the train, and I could go anywhere and do anything. And she, in contrast, was pursuing a degree, a certificate program in English, being a translator, and I thought she was exotic, grounded, fabulous, sweet. And so before the week was out, I was in Lake Placid again, this time actually helping my friend's dad. And I said to myself that I would just go back up. And true to form, I didn't call or write or anything. And luckily, on the day that I was leaving, the little mail boat came around. And it was a card from her saying...
In Lake Placid.
In Lake Placid, right, because there are no roads. I was on the far side of the lake. So although I was quite good at bicycling, I was terrible with the boat. And it took me many tries if I couldn't go straight into the slip and then hit the reverse, I needed the same paddle my friend had used. So on that very day, it was a great coincidence, on that very day, a letter arrived from her saying that she'd moved and, that I should come visit. Say no more. So I left.
Don't even say that.
That's right. So I left that day and bicycled up to Montreal and banged on the door.
How far is that, Montreal to Lake Placid to Montreal?
It was 120 miles, which is the most that I had ever ridden in a day.
Oh, you rode it in one day?
I rode it in one day.
Wow.
Yeah. I set out with my bike tied down to the boat, navigating through the fog. But it's beautiful too. Mm. And the worst that happens when you have no real plans is you don't make it in a day, sleep somewhere.
Right.
And they didn't have a buzzer. I remember thinking it just didn't seem fair that, out of however many hundred apartments there were, that only the good apartments got buzzers. Everybody else, I didn't even know what to do. So, but eventually someone walked out. So I just walked through and I went up with my bike and knocked on the door. And her roommate took one look at me and turned to her friend and said, that fellow you met last week is here. And that was the beginning of our relationship. Every week or so, one of us would go up or the other one would come down. I remember my brother Mike came over and we drove up together to meet her.
He came back with news that she was fabulous.
She was fabulous.
She was perfect. She was beautiful. She was sweeter than anything that could ever
Yes,
met.
she is.
That's what I heard.
Yes, she is. And we've done, I think that the two things that I'm proudest of are first that we have such two great kids, but second that we've managed to keep that marriage, that relationship together. She really is great.
So you still have that sense.
I do.
Yeah, that's so nice.
Yeah, we've had to hammer around a couple of things, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, definitely have to. So then when you, how much time elapsed then before you decided to get married? A long time or a little bit of time?
Well, at the end of that summer, I called you up. I think I talked to you first and said, that the girl that I'd perhaps mentioned before was flying back to Spain, and that I was going to come home and say goodbye to everybody and go follow her. And what I heard later from you and Dad is that you figured that was the moment. But I was still halfway in between, footloose and fancy-free and committed.
Committed, yeah, that's very nice, right?
But so I spent a month and a half in Spain.
And you met her family?
I met her family.
How do they like you?
With skepticism and suspicion, but and actually until many years later, from my point of view, not one person spoke one word of English except Miriam, and it turns out later actually practically everybody can speak quite a bit of English, but
they're testing you, or they're
testing me out, and it was her mom actually who would sit down with me evenings and we would have tea, and use what little English she knew and what French I knew to build up a Spanish vocabulary.
Oh.
And then
Oh, you mean that's how you learn Spanish?
from her mom, yes.
Oh, my
Not from Miriam. She has no patience.
Perfect
No.
in so many ways, but that one way, no.
In that one way,
Yeah.
right. I'm not fast enough yet.
Oh, so Miriam's mother taught you Spanish. That's
Well, it
very
helps a lot being there, because everything,
Right,
the
right,
billboards and everybody's
right.
speaking in Spanish. But that was her mom and I spent evening after evening talking about books and movies and what it had been like for her to grow up in Spain. You know, what it was like to have Miriam as a kid, her youngest.
Yeah.
But
What was her life like growing up in Spain?
well, Miriam's mom, unlike Miriam and her youngest of older brothers, Bruno, her mom was more like her grandmother in being very much in favor of Franco and that side of the war. And in fact, if you ever get Miriam in here, one of the things to ask her is whether it's true that her mom snuck across lines with messages.
Really?
Yes,
For
because
Franco's forces? right?
that's right.
Oh, my goodness.
That's right. I think the families, the revolutionaries in the family have long since forgiven her.
And I heard that she was just remarkably beautiful. Her mother, like Miriam. Well, actually, I remember that time that we went traveling in Valencia, and you had the job of translating for how did that go? We were all in that taxi cab, that open cab with her grandmother, and the cab driver who was a rebel, and the grandmother who was a Francophile.
Right.
Or I guess they don't say Francophile.
Right.
It means something different. But then, and in every tourist thing, the grandmother you were supposed to translate. So you
Right.
tell you that story.
Right. So the open air carriage was actually a horse-drawn carriage, right? And we were all piled in, and the person who should have been translating would have been someone like Miriam,
Right.
not only fluent in both, but skilled in navigating these
Exactly.
subtle and yet cloudy waters, right?
Right. They weren't so subtle, really.
Right. Instead, we had the driver, who was just a continuous barrage of stories about this and that and the other thing, and the mom, who had another continuous barrage of stories about what it was like, and what had changed, and I actually had a great time because it was like fishing. You could pick and pull little stories from each part.
And it seemed to come through, I didn't know the Spanish. It seemed to come through that the driver was fiercely against the political regime, and the grandmother was completely in favor.
Right.
So that somehow
Right.
you were having to translate both these stories, and it just looks
Right.
so odd.
They were along classic class barriers.
Classic class barriers.
Yes,
Right? Okay, so then you went to Spain. You had a great time there, right?
I did.
And you stayed there the whole summer? Or?
No, I just stayed for 6 weeks or so. Actually, I crashed Miriam's car.
Oh.
And
Did you leave immediately afterwards?
No, I went and found her. One of the things that was hard for me to get used to is how small all the spaces are.
In Spain?
Right, and so you have to get a car out of the garage, you have to maneuver, you have to back into one space and out into the other till you can finally line it up with the garage. And I'm taller than a lot of the things, so the spaces were tiny. And just one time I just couldn't get it. I couldn't. Nothing seemed right. Very different from American parking garages, which are all right angles. And so I scraped the side of her car, and I felt terrible. And I said, it's just everything. It's not just that. It's the money, and everybody speaks Spanish and everything. I just need a break. And so actually I flew home, and I was home for a while. And we had, in our very responsible way, resolved that I would go back to school and become serious. I would go to teacher's college and get a degree and teach, and she would finish her school, and then later, some later date, we would get back together. And that lasted maybe 2 months. She came to visit in Christmas, and actually she stayed with me, and so did a guy named Andre that I'd met on one of the bike rides up to Canada. And when she left, I realized it was hopeless. I couldn't stay in America, and so I flew back there.
This is a romantic story, Gregory.
In a way. The romantic part is all of us reacting to things. The unromantic part is all of these ideas we have, not one of which seem to work out. But then we came back together, and I proposed to her not far from your house in a classic spring morning with, mist in the air drizzling through, and she accepted.
Very nice.
Boom, that's it.
Very nice. So then you got married both in America and in Spain.
Yep, we got married twice. Yeah. December 29th in America and July 5th.
Right, in Spain.
December 29th, my great brother stepped in as best man.
Right.
Because my best friend, the same David Cooper, who's been woven in and out of these stories, was stuck in a train.
Oh.
I think just north of Baltimore.
Oh, he was on his way to...
He was on his way, and we finally couldn't wait anymore. And as I said to him later, when you have an actual date, you might want to leave a little earlier than that morning. But it was fine.
But then later, was he best man at...
He was.
Spain, yeah.
He was. And that was another one where we had all these great plans. We'd talk to the priest. By then, I'm even better in Spanish. We had this whole idea that the priest was ready to give the service in English for the non-Spanish speakers, and in Spanish, although Spanish and Latin, for the traditionalists. And we'd written in a role for my friend David, who had the ring, and so some of this was extra. We had to actually have a service, because this was the big deal was we'd gotten the civil marriage in New York, actually in Dobbs, and then now we were having the tremendous religious marriage that would cement our union for all of posterity. And to do this, we sought records of possible religious affiliations that I might have had earlier in my life, so that now I at least had the right to sign away my kids to their religious education of the future. And in the end, everything got signed, and it was okay. They would marry us. But once the magic moment came, the priest forgot anything in English. He just ran along in Spanish. He ran along in Spanish, and he ran faster. And since there was some Latin involved too, I had no idea what was going on. None. And none of it matched the practice. And my friend David there, his face went white, and he's holding the ring. He's getting closer and closer because he's hoping that I will signal him, because I'm really his contact here, but I have no idea. And finally, there's this one moment where they're all, and there are parts I'm supposed to say, and I mumble them back, and parts that she says, and she says them very clearly. We finally get to the moment where no one is speaking. No one. And I'm looking around, and my friend is looking around, and the priest is looking around, and the helper is looking around. They've completely forgotten the script, so they don't even know who has the ring. Luckily, Miriam clues me in, and so I point to my friend, and he pulls it out and gives it, and then from that moment they raced on there. But really, it's proof positive that the man, and the groom and his helper are the least important people in the whole marriage, because actually, except for the part where they all say, "Okay, now it's your turn," that was it. Everything else happened sort of around us.
That's as it should be. Really.
As it is.
Right.
It's as it should be.
I was there. It was fabulous.
Right, you were there, and you were there first too, because all day long I'd been told, "Don't come out, don't look here, don't look at that." And in the end, I just sort of I thought, well, whenever people stop saying that, that's when I'll go. And the actual procession went out of my mother-in-law's house and down the road, and was actually starting on into the chapel. And I was still, not looking here and not doing that, just sort of waiting. And finally someone said, "Okay, now you." And so I had to run along to catch up.
And something that impressed me there was that the villagers were out there sweeping their sidewalks that she was going to walk along. And then they were sprinkling greens. Somebody was sprinkling cut greens so that she walked along with the bride dress. She'd be walking over greens. And actually, you couldn't look. That was one of the things you couldn't look at.
Right.
But it was fantastic. It looked like the 15th century. Her father walking along, and her in that beautiful dress. And she herself looked so beautiful.
It was fabulous.
Yeah. It was.
A little out of my league, but fabulous. Yeah.
So this is the woman that said, "Oh, well, if you need to take a vacation, a little trip, be solitude."
Right, many years later.
So I guess that was about, how many? About like 9 or 10 years later?
Right.
Okay, so coming back to that, where was she and where were you, and how did it happen? And how did the trip itself happen?
One of the things that we resolved as a family is that however little or however much money we had, that we would fly back to Spain in the summers. And so I've been working as a teacher. I've tried to avoid having any commitments in the summers. Sometimes I've taken some grant work or writing work with me. But every summer we burn out the savings account and take the 2 kids to Spain and only bring them back when it's time to go to school again. And so for me to do this meant that she was going to take the kids to Spain without me. And I was actually going to stay in the country. I flew to Michael's house in Santa Cruz and spent a few days with him, living in half of a converted garage with him and his son. And then they drove me to the Golden Gate Bridge, and I hugged everybody, and his son's mom was there, and we all took pictures, and then I set off to head east, real turnaround
from the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah. Yes, and I was following a route that was planned out by a bicycle organization that's trying to build a network of cycling routes across the country. And I just mostly bicycled east, again sleeping where there was a spot, and some of that more successfully, some less successfully. And I made my way over the mountains and onto Highway 50.
I took that route.
It's great, isn't it?
Later that summer. And
That's right.
Driving, it was terrifying driving. It was so steep up the mountains and so curvy and such big drop-offs. I couldn't imagine you. I saw your little ghost there. I couldn't imagine you taking that trip. So then you went over the mountains, and then what?
The thing that I found fascinating is because of the various geologic changes that have taken place in that part of America, what you have are little ridges of mountains separated by 20 or 30 miles of plains, and then another ridge of mountains, and then plains. So as you're traversing these on a very human scale, you feel like you've got a task each day. Your task is to be from the top of the mountain, get to the next set of mountains. It's not that any one of them is too difficult, but it's so different from the other places I've been. It's like a moonscape, baked dry, little hexagonal tiles. It was astonishing, and graffiti changes because people would put like little hearts or initials. Or there was a picture of a bicycle, and they make them out of little dried stones that they press up against the embankments.
Clay.
Right.
Oh, that's
Right.
very interesting. You can't paint because that doesn't stick to anything.
Right.
It's just sand.
Right.
Oh, that's right. But the urge for graffiti.
Is irresistible.
Yeah. Right.
Right. I didn't make any though.
So then you got across the mountains, and what happened?
When the terrain changed again in Colorado, I was close to Durango, and I decided that
And between Durango and the mountains, I want to hear that scary story.
well, give me a
we've only got a
hint.
couple
Right.
minutes.
Right. Give me a
Going across the
5
desert,
second hint.
no water, carrying all the water on your back, running
Right.
out of water, seeing that there was a possible place for water, having to go through the cows. That story. You've only got 2 minutes to tell it.
Right. My big investment for this trip was to get a water purifier, and it's true that there were some places where I miscalculated the water, or you would get to a national park area that would be dry. It would have no water. There'd be little signs when you got there saying no water here, but of course by then it's too late because you've already bicycled for 6 or 7 miles, and you're 3 or 4 miles away hours away of bicycling from the next water. So sometimes I was just a little bit worried about water. And so this one time I saw that there was, out of this desert, was just like this green expanse with cows. So you knew they had water. And
the green had water.
right, it was a giveaway. Also cows. I mean, cows don't live in the desert. And so I went in there and I climbed over the fences with my stuff. And sure enough, there was a little thing where they were pumping water up out of the ground. And it was just running into a little trough. So
There was a pump working independently there?
right, it just shot water into a trough for the cows.
Really? So it was some sort of electrical...
Classic use of desert land. That rice paddies, cows. But I refilled water there.
And you went through a purifier.
Right. Right.
Did the cows resent it?
Not at all.
Oh.
But in the end, getting to Durango, I felt like I'd seen the stuff I wanted to see.
Done the hard part.
Missed my family. And so I rented a car and drove to Denver and flew home and bid on tickets to Spain. And boom, like that. I spent the last 2 weeks with my wife and kids. So I had the best of both worlds.
That sounds wonderful. Greg, you have the best of all worlds.
Yes.
Well, thanks, Greg. That was very lovely.
It was a pleasure, Mom.